February 1918. The Great War had exhausted both sides, but now a hope for victory has appeared for the Central Powers. The Reds had taken power in Russia, and as a part of the internal struggle, they have ordered all of the Russian army to be disbanded. As the Russian soldiers went home, the Central Powers prepared to seize the economic resources of the former Russian Empire by launching an invasion along the whole front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. They had 450,000 regular soldiers of the German and Austro-Hungarian armies. The Reds could oppose them with several 100,000 militiamen of low combat value. They began to rally their militia west, behind a new defensive line, to resist the Central Powers. A new campaign began on the Eastern Front. Between these opponents were the national units of the old Russian army, which pursued their own interests. Some of them sided with the Reds, and others cooperated with the Central Powers. We will first look at the offensive on the northern part of the front. The Germans had a force of 220,000 troops. The Reds attempted to rally the militias of large cities behind a new defensive line. In the central part of the front, the Germans planned to advance up to the Reds' defensive line on the Dnieper River. In this area was the 1st Polish Corps. It had become hostile to the Reds. This was helpful for the Germans, as this tied up most of the Reds' forces in the region, and the Reds did not have the strength to stop the German army. On February 18th, the Germans launched the offensive. The Red forces abandoned Minsk and retreated to the Berezina River. However, they did not have the strength to hold the river line and fell back to Orsha. There they were strengthened with fresh forces and attempted to resist, but they could not match the regular German army and were defeated. The Germans occupied Orsha in early March. With the advance on the flanks, the Germans had secured most of their territorial goals in the central part of the front in 2 weeks. At the same time, the German forces were also advancing near the Baltic. The Reds decided to hold a defensive line on the lakes, with Narva and Pskov being their main strongholds. There were also the Estonian and Latvian national units of the old Russian army in the region. However, the Estonian division declared itself neutral in the conflict between the Reds and the Central Powers, and the Reds ordered the Latvian Corps to fall back behind their defensive line. This left the Reds' position weakly defended. The Reds lacked strong militias in the Baltic, and the German forces advanced quickly. The Germans assaulted Pskov and took the town from the Red forces sent from Petrograd. The German forces reached the territory of Estonia. There were only 4,000 Red militias remaining in the area to oppose the Germans. The Germans easily defeated the Reval militias. They then headed east. They attacked the Reds near Narva and captured the town. They reached the approaches of Petrograd. With that, the Central Powers had taken the lands they wanted on the northern part of the front. They stopped their advance and went on the defensive. The fighting between the Reds and the Central Powers on the northern part of the Eastern Front ended. But fighting further north was just beginning. There was Finland. It had recently become independent from Russia. But the revolution in Russia had a negative effect on the internal stability of Finland. The country had become divided and had descended into a civil war between its own Reds and Whites. Germany decided to intervene on the White side in the Finnish Civil War. The Finnish Reds had 80,000 militiamen. These forces were much more numerous than the forces that had opposed Germany in the Baltic. Due to ice conditions, the Germans had to make a landing on the Reds-controlled southern coast of Finland. This was made easier by the Finnish Whites offensive, which began in mid-March. The Red and White forces were numerically similar, but the Whites had a better command. Near Tampere, the White and Red forces were almost equal, but the Whites' leadership drew up a plan to encircle the Reds' forces in the town. The Whites attacked and encircled the Reds. Their forces had to surrender. They lost more than 10,000 troops. This made them move their forces from southern Finland to the north in order to resist the Whites. This in turn weakened their defenses on the coast. In early April, Germany landed its forces in a safe place in southern Finland and then it advanced towards Helsinki, the country's capital. The German forces stormed the weakly defended city and took it. This allowed them to make some additional landings. By the middle of April, Germany had landed 14,000 soldiers on the southern coast of Finland. The Finnish Red's southern front was fully exposed. They attempted to pull out their forces from western Finland to the east, but they could not make it in time. The German and White Finnish forces linked up and cut off the Finnish Red's path of retreat. The Finnish Red's forces in western Finland were then encircled and surrendered to the White forces. With most of the Red troops defeated, the Finnish Whites concentrated a superior force against the remaining Red units near Viipuri. They attacked and took the town from the Red forces. Soon, the remaining Red Finnish forces surrendered. The Whites had won the Finnish Civil War, and Germany had secured Finland as a new member of its sphere of influence. For the most part, the First World War in Northern Europe came to an end. At the same time, fighting took place in the south. Here, the Central Powers wanted to occupy large areas. The goal of the Central Powers was to secure the lands claimed by the Ukrainian People's Republic. The Central Powers had 230,000 troops. Their southern flank was held by the Romanian army, which was still intact, and the Central Powers decided to advance from the north. On their path were several military formations. The largest of them was the 42,000 men strong Czechoslovak Corps of the Old Army. But it decided it stood little chance in this situation and began to retreat east. The remaining forces in the region were the 1,500 Red troops and 3,000 soldiers of the Ukrainian People's Republic. The Ukrainian People's Republic had allied itself with the Central Powers. When the Central Powers began advancing, the Ukrainian People's Republic's forces attacked the Reds, who then fell back to Kyiv. The German and UPR forces then occupied the city, securing the capital of the Ukrainian People's Republic. The Central Powers were having success also further south. The Second Polish Corps began retreating east from this region, and so did the Serb, Croat and Slovene division. The advance by the Austro-Hungarian forces into the flank of the Romanian army made Romania stop fighting and become neutral. By early March, the Reds had regrouped their forces and set up a new defensive line in Ukraine. They prepared to stop the Central Powers' offensive. In the south, the Reds had 4,000 troops. The Central Powers' goal was to capture Odessa. They reached the Reds' forward defensive line. They assaulted it and overwhelmed it. They then moved towards Odessa. The Reds could not put up strong resistance, and the Central Powers captured Odessa in mid-March. Most of the city's defenders left by boat, which weakened the Reds' defenses. The Central Powers outflanked the Reds' defensive line and captured Mykolaiv. But then the militias of Mykolaiv and Kherson rose up against the Central Powers, and the fighting stalled their advance for several weeks. This allowed the Reds to concentrate most of their troops in the north, where they were able to resist the advance of 3 German divisions and slow down the Central Powers' offensive. East of the Dnieper River, the Reds had also established a new defensive line. The Germans attacked, but they encountered strong resistance by the retreating Czechoslovak forces near Bakhmach. The Germans got bogged down in fighting with the Czechoslovaks. After the Czechoslovaks continued the retreat and abandoned Bakhmach, the Germans switched their focus against the Red forces further south. The Red forces alone were too weak to halt the Central Powers, but they attempted to slow them down on the river lines. In mid-March, the German and Ukrainian People's Republic's forces attacked, and the Reds retreated behind the first river. The Reds attempted to hold the river, but the Central Powers launched an outflanking movement, forcing the Reds to retreat behind the second river. The Central Powers outflanked the Reds' position again, and they retreated behind the third river line near Poltava. By early April, the Central Powers' forces also broke through this line. The Reds prepared to defend Kharkiv. By that time, the Reds had grown their forces to 24,000 troops. But then the Reds' defenses collapsed. The Germans launched an unexpected attack from Konotop. They outflanked the Reds' position and advanced towards Kharkiv from the north. The Reds in Kharkiv were trapped between two Central Powers forces coming from north and west. They were defeated. Part of their forces were encircled and they suffered heavy losses. This made the Reds fall back all the way to the approaches of the Donbas industrial area. West of the Dnieper River, the Red militias had been engaged in fighting for more than a week and could not hold out anymore. They broke and gave up several territories without resistance. The Germans advanced and occupied Katerinoslav and crossed the Dnieper without much resistance. The Reds attempted to hold on to Oleksandrivsk as their last defensive line, but in mid-April this position was broken by the German forces. The Reds pulled their troops back to the approaches of the Donbas industrial area, preparing for their last stand in Ukraine. This left the southern direction uncovered. The Central Powers headed south towards Crimea. Meanwhile, their other forces had suppressed the uprisings in Mykolaiv and Kherson and crossed the Dnieper River. Together, these forces advanced into the Crimea and occupied the peninsula. The last remaining defensive position for the Reds was the Donbas industrial area, where they had concentrated most of their remaining forces. In late April, the Central Powers launched the offensive to take Donbas and occupy the remaining territories claimed by the Ukrainian People's Republic. They outflanked the Reds' position from the north, and then they attacked the Reds and advanced deep in the Donbas industrial area. The Red forces fell back in order not to be cut off, but after that they decided to completely withdraw from Donbas. The Reds fully retreated from the territory claimed by the Ukrainian People's Republic. The Germans followed them and occupied Rostov and Novocherkassk. With this, they had taken all the lands claimed by the Ukrainian People's Republic and also taken some buffer territories. By early May, the Central Powers had achieved their territorial goals on the Eastern Front and they stopped their offensive. The fighting between the Reds and the Central Powers came to an end. For the rest of 1918, the Central Powers would have a dominating position in Eastern Europe. The Central Powers offensive was over, but the Reds would soon have to fight against a new opponent. Seeing the Reds' weakness, the White forces would rise up in several regions and begin opposing the Reds. Another conflict engulfed the area as the civil war spread into new territories.